James Mitchell had always been the type of person who acted before thinking. At 28 years old, he worked as a maintenance supervisor at a busy London hotel, spending his days fixing broken pipes and dealing with demanding guests. Life had been particularly stressful lately. His landlord was threatening eviction. His girlfriend had left him the month before. His boss seemed to find fault with everything he did. On that fateful Tuesday morning in July, James decided to take a different route to work. Instead of his usual path through the crowded subway, he chose to walk through the tourist areas of central London. The summer heat was already building, even at 9 in the morning, and sweat began to form on his forehead as he hurried along the busy sidewalks as he approached Buckingham Palace. James noticed the usual crowd of tourists gathering to watch the changing of the guard ceremony. The red-uniformed guards stood motionless at their posts, their tall black hats creating perfect silhouettes against the morning sky. James had seen this sight hundreds of times before, but today something felt different. Maybe it was his mounting frustration with life, or perhaps the oppressive heat was getting to him more than usual. The crowd pressed closer to the palace gates, tourists from every corner of the world jostling for the perfect photograph. Children squealed with excitement, while their parents held smartphones high above their heads. James found himself pushed toward the front of the crowd, directly facing one of the royal guards who stood perfectly still, eyes fixed straight ahead. Guard appeared to be in his early 20s, with a stern expression that never wavered despite the chaos around him. His red tunic was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, and his rifle held at precisely the correct angle. James stared at the young man, wondering what it must be like to stand there for hours without moving. The hundreds of people who treated him more like a statue than a human being. That's when James noticed he was still carrying his water bottle from his morning jog. The plastic container was filled with cool water, and condensation had formed on its surface. Without really understanding why, James felt an overwhelming urge to do something unexpected, something that would break the monotony of his increasingly difficult life. The crowd around him continued to surge forward, cameras clicking constantly. A group of teenagers nearby were trying to make the guard laugh by pulling funny faces and waving their arms. An elderly couple argued loudly about the best angle for their photo. A tour guide shouted information about the palace's history over the din of voices. James looked at the water bottle in his hand, then at the motionless guard. The idea that formed in his mind was completely irrational, but the stress and frustration of recent weeks seemed to cloud his judgment. He told himself it would just be a harmless prank, a moment of spontaneity in an otherwise predictable day. After all, what was the worst that could happen? Before James could reconsider his impulsive decision, he twisted the cap off his water bottle and squeezed it firmly. A stream of cold water shot across the space between him and the royal guard, splashing directly onto the young soldier's face in pristine red uniform. The water ran down the guard's cheeks and dripped onto his polished boots, creating dark spots on the fabric of his tunic. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The crowd around James fell completely silent, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire scene. Hundreds of tourists stood frozen, their mouths hanging open in shock. Even the crying babies seemed to stop their wailing. The only sound was the gentle dripping of water from the guard's uniform onto the pavement. Below, James felt his stomach drop as the reality of what he had just done hit him like a brick wall. The royal guard, despite the water streaming down his face, maintained his position with remarkable discipline. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, though James could see a slight twitch in his jaw muscle. The young soldier's training was clearly overriding any natural impulse to react to the unexpected assault. Within seconds, the silence was broken by the sharp blast of whistles. Palace security guards appeared from seemingly nowhere, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Two police officers who had been stationed nearby came running toward the scene, their heavy boots pounding against the pavement. The crowd began to scatter, some people running away while others pushed forward. Eager to witness the unfolding drama, James found himself surrounded by security personnel before he could even think about running. His hands were quickly pulled behind his back, and he felt the cold metal of handcuffs click around his wrists. The water bottle fell from his grasp and rolled across the ground, coming to rest against the palace gate. "You're under arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard," one of the officers announced loudly enough for the remaining crowd to hear. James's heart pounded so hard he was sure everyone around him could hear it. The magnitude of his mistake was becoming clearer with each passing second, as he was led away from the scene. James caught a glimpse of the Royal Guard, who was finally being relieved of his post. The young soldier walked with perfect posture toward the palace entrance, water still visible on his uniform. James wanted to call out an apology to explain that it had been a momentary lapse in judgment, but his voice seemed to have disappeared entirely. The crowd of tourists began to buzz with excitement, their cameras now focused on James as he was escorted toward a waiting police van. He could hear fragments of conversations in multiple languages, with people speculating about what would happen to him next. Some tourists seemed thrilled to have witnessed such an unusual event, while others appeared genuinely shocked by his disrespectful behavior. As the police van doors closed behind him, James realized that his simple walk to work had turned into the biggest mistake of his life. He had no idea that this single moment of poor judgment would set in motion a series of events that would change not only his own future, but also touch the lives of people he had never even imagined meeting. The police station where James was taken was a busy, intimidating place filled with the sounds of ringing phones, typing keyboards, and multiple conversations happening simultaneously. He was processed quickly but thoroughly, with officers taking his fingerprints, photographing him from multiple angles, and asking him to empty his pockets completely. The reality of his situation began to sink in as he sat in a small, windowless interview room waiting to be questioned. Detective Sarah Chen entered the room carrying a thick folder and a cup of coffee that smelled much better than anything James had been offered. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes but a serious expression that made it clear she had dealt with many difficult cases throughout her career. She sat across from James and opened the folder, revealing several photographs of the incident, taken by tourists and security cameras. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, her voice calm but firm, "do you understand the severity of what happened today? You assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard while he was performing his official duties. This isn't just a simple prank or a moment of poor judgment. This is a serious criminal offense that could result in significant jail time." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still wearing the same clothes that now felt damp with sweat and regret. Tried to explain his actions, telling Detective Chen about his recent struggles with work, his relationship problems, and the mounting stress that seemed to be overwhelming every aspect of his life. She listened patiently, taking notes, but showing no signs of sympathy for his excuses. "I understand that life can be difficult," Detective Chen replied after James finished his explanation. "But thousands of people face similar challenges every day without assaulting members of the royal family's protection detail. Your personal problems don't justify what you did, and they certainly won't help you in court." As the hours passed, James learned more about the potential consequences of his actions. He could face charges of assault, disturbing the peace, and potentially even terrorism-related offenses if prosecutors decided to argue that his actions were intended to disrupt royal security protocols. The maximum sentence could be several years in prison, along with a permanent criminal record that would make finding employment extremely difficult. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading rapidly through social media and traditional news outlets. Videos taken by tourists were being shared thousands of times, with James's face clearly visible in many of them. News reporters were already gathering outside the police station, hoping to get more information about the man who had dared to attack a royal guard. The royal guard who had been sprayed. A young man named Private Thomas Wright was also dealing with the aftermath of the incident. After changing into a fresh uniform, he had been questioned by his superior officers about the event. Despite his professional handling of the situation, there were concerns about security protocols and whether additional measures needed to be implemented to protect the guards from similar incidents in the future. Private Wright, who had been serving in the Queen's Guard for only 8 months, found himself at the center of a media storm he had never anticipated. His calm, professional response to being sprayed with water was being praised by his commanding officers and the general public alike. But he was also required to write detailed reports about the incident and participate in a review of security procedures. As evening approached, James was informed that he would be spending the night in a police cell while prosecutors decided what charges to file against him. The small, cold room contained only a narrow bed and a toilet, and the fluorescent lights remained on throughout the night. He lay awake thinking about how a single moment of stupidity had managed to destroy his already fragile life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The next morning brought news that James never could have expected. Detective Chen returned to his cell with a confused expression on her face, carrying a message that would change everything. During the night, the incident had not only gone viral on social media, but it had caught the attention of someone very important within the royal household itself. "Mr. Mitchell," Detective Chen said, unlocking his cell door, "I have to admit, in 20 years of police work, I've never had to deliver a message quite like this one. You're being released on bail, and you've been requested to appear at Buckingham Palace this afternoon for a private meeting." James stared at her in complete disbelief. He had expected to face serious criminal charges, possibly even deportation, if the authorities decided to make an example of him. The last thing he had imagined was being invited to the very place where he had committed his crime. The detective explained that the request had come through official channels, with proper documentation and security clearances already being arranged. James would be escorted to the palace by plainclothes officers and would meet with representatives of the royal household. The purpose of the meeting was not explained, but Detective Chen assured him that it was legitimate and that refusing the invitation would likely result in more serious consequences. As James was released from custody, he discovered that the story had become international news. Reporters and camera crews were waiting outside the police station, shouting questions and taking photographs as he was quickly escorted to an unmarked car. The headlines on newspaper stands were dramatic and varied. "Tourist attacks Royal Guard, water bottle incident shocks palace. An American creates diplomatic incident in London." The car ride to Buckingham Palace was surreal. James sat in the back seat between two security officers, watching the familiar streets of London pass by the window. He wondered if this would be the last time he would see the city as a free man, or if something even more unexpected was about to happen. When they arrived at the palace, James was taken through a side entrance he had never known existed. The corridors inside were more elegant and impressive than anything he had ever seen, with paintings, sculptures, and furnishings that clearly represented centuries of British history. Every person they passed wore either an expensive suit or an official uniform, and James became acutely aware of his own casual clothing and disheveled appearance. He was led to a small but beautifully decorated waiting room, where he sat alone. For nearly an hour, the silence was broken only by the ticking of an antique clock on the wall and the distant sounds of activity elsewhere in the palace. James tried to prepare himself for whatever was about to happen, but his mind kept racing through dozens of different scenarios, none of which seemed particularly pleasant. When the door finally opened, James was surprised to see Private Thomas Wright enter the room. The young guard was dressed in civilian clothes rather than his formal uniform, and his expression was curious rather than angry. Behind him walked an older man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Sir Charles Pemberton, a senior advisor to the royal household. "Mr. Mitchell," Sir Charles began, "I imagine you're wondering why you're here instead of sitting in a jail cell. The truth is, your actions yesterday have created an opportunity that none of us anticipated. Private Wright has a story to tell you, and after you hear it, I think you'll understand why this meeting was necessary." James looked at the young guard, trying to read his expression. Private Wright seemed nervous but determined, and when he began to speak, his words were the last thing James expected to hear. Private Thomas Wright cleared his throat and looked directly at James before beginning his unexpected story. "Mr. Mitchell, what you did yesterday was completely inappropriate and could have had serious consequences. But I need to tell you something. That might help you understand why you're here instead of facing criminal charges." Thomas explained that he had been struggling with severe depression and anxiety since joining the Queen's Guard. 8 months earlier, the pressure of maintaining perfect discipline while on duty, combined with the isolation he felt from being constantly stared at and photographed by strangers, had been taking a serious toll on his mental health. "I had been considering requesting a transfer or even leaving the military entirely. Standing there yesterday morning, I was having one of the worst days I'd experienced since putting on this uniform, Thomas continued. I had been thinking about how meaningless it all felt, how I was just a tourist attraction rather than a real soldier. I was questioning everything about my service and my future. James listened in stunned silence as Thomas described how the water spray, while shocking and unprofessional, had somehow snapped him out of his darkest thoughts. The incident had reminded him that he was human, that he was capable of handling unexpected situations with grace and professionalism, and that his training and discipline meant something more than just standing motionless for tourists. Sir Charles Pemberton took over the conversation at this point, explaining that Thomas's commanding officers had been impressed by his handling of the situation. Rather than losing composure or breaking protocol, the young guard had demonstrated exactly the kind of character and professionalism that the Queen's Guard was meant to represent. The incident has actually become a teaching moment for our security protocols, Sir Charles continued. We've realized that our guards need better preparation for dealing with unpredictable situations, and Thomas's response has become a model for how such incidents should be handled. But the most surprising revelation was still to come. The Royal. A household had been so impressed with Thomas's professionalism that they had decided to nominate him for a commendation. More importantly, they wanted to use the incident as an opportunity to address the mental health challenges faced by young soldiers in high-pressure ceremonial roles. We're announcing a new support program for members of the Ceremonial Guard, Sir Charles explained. Thomas will be working with military counselors and mental health professionals to develop better support systems for soldiers who are struggling with the unique pressures of this type of service. James was amazed to learn that his moment of stupidity had inadvertently led to positive changes within one of Britain's most traditional military units. But Sir Charles wasn't finished with his surprises. Mr. Mitchell, we have a proposal for you, the royal advisor continued. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, we would like you to participate in a public service campaign about the importance of respecting military personnel and the consequences of inappropriate behavior toward service members. The campaign would involve James working with military charities, speaking to school groups about his experience, and helping to raise awareness about the human side of the soldiers who serve in ceremonial roles. In exchange, the charges against him would be reduced to a simple fine and community service, with no jail time or permanent criminal record. Thomas Wright looked at James with an expression that was no longer hostile but genuinely hopeful. Your actions were wrong, he said. But if we can use what happened to help other soldiers and educate the public, then maybe something good can come from all of this. James felt overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. What had started as the worst mistake of his life was somehow being transformed into an opportunity for redemption and positive change. 6 months later, James Mitchell stood in front of a group of high school students in Manchester, telling his story for the 100th time since that fateful day at Buckingham Palace. The presentation had become polished and effective, but he never lost sight of the genuine remorse he felt for his actions and the unexpected lessons he had learned from their consequences. The public service campaign had been more successful than anyone had anticipated. James's willingness to admit his mistakes and work toward positive change had resonated with people across Britain and beyond. Videos of his school presentations had been viewed millions of times online, and the message about respecting military personnel had reached audiences that traditional campaigns had never been able to touch. Private Thomas Wright had become something of a celebrity within military circles. His professional handling of the water spray incident had been featured in training materials, and his work developing mental health support programs for ceremonial guards had been adopted by military units in several other countries. The young soldier had found a new sense of purpose in his service, using his experience to help other soldiers who were struggling with similar challenges. The friendship that had developed between James and Thomas was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire incident. What had begun as a criminal assault had evolved into a partnership focused on positive change and mutual understanding. They had appeared together on television programs, at military events, and in schools across the country, sharing their story and the lessons they had learned. James's personal life had also been transformed by the experience. The publicity surrounding the incident and his subsequent community service work had led to new job opportunities with a military charity organization. He had found a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. And the stress and frustration that had led to his poor decision at the palace had been replaced by genuine fulfillment in his work. The mental health support program that Thomas had helped develop had already assisted dozens of young soldiers who were struggling with the unique pressures of ceremonial duty. The program included counseling services, peer support groups, and modified duty schedules for soldiers who needed additional assistance. Other military units had begun implementing similar programs based on the success of the pilot project. On the anniversary of the incident, James and Thomas returned to Buckingham Palace together. This time, as invited guests, rather than criminal and victim, they met with Sir Charles Pemberton and other royal household officials to discuss the ongoing success of their public service campaign and to plan future initiatives as they stood outside the palace gates looking at the spot where everything had changed a year earlier. Both men reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them together. James had learned that a single moment of poor judgment didn't have to define a person's entire future, while Thomas had discovered that even the most difficult experiences could lead to positive change and personal growth. The tourist crowds gathered around them were taking the same photographs and videos that thousands of others had captured over the years. But now when James looked at the royal guards standing at their posts, he saw them as real people with real challenges, rather than simply tourist attractions. And when Thomas wore his ceremonial uniform, he carried with him the knowledge that his service had meaning beyond mere tradition. Their story had become a powerful reminder that even the most regrettable actions could sometimes lead to unexpected opportunities for redemption, friendship, and positive change. What had begun as one man's worst day had ultimately become a catalyst for helping others in creating lasting improvements in the lives of young soldiers serving their country.